What branch of the military were you in?
The Army.
Can you tell us why you joined?
I didn't join. I was drafted out of high school.
How old were you when you were drafted?
18.
Can you tell us what boot camp was like?
Nothing but hiking and rifle drilling and the firearms.
Where were you first deployed?
I was deployed to Europe.
Do you know specifically where you were deployed?
I first went into France, then from France into Belgium.
How many soldiers were in your division?
Approximately 60,000.
Can you describe how you felt when you landed in Europe?
I was kind of devastated by what I saw that was destroyed prior to me arriving.
Can you describe what Europe looked like during the war?
Bombed out.
Can you be more specific?
A lot of people, no homes, a lot of dead cattle in the fields. Farms were disrupted. Must have been tough living for the people there.
Do you remember how your comrades felt?
The same way. Remember that we were drafted for the invasion, and therefore we were all of school age and very young. We weren't veterans.
How did you manage to keep it together?
Maybe it was because we didn't know any other way of behaving, so it didn't seem to affect us that way, mentally. But just the idea of being was unseeming, that you never seen it at home.
Thank you. Can you describe how the Germans were like at that time?
Well, you have to remember, in the military at the time, they had a policy, no fraternization. In other words, you weren't allowed to be with them, speak with them, total non-fraternization. And that applied to everybody. But as the war progressed, and as we got further into Germany, it became that it was almost impossible not to fraternize because there were so many civilians on the road trying to find a way out of the battles and whatnot. And we ran into them, and you got to remember, there were some still living in the basements of their homes. And we, for one, didn't think to sleep outdoors when there's a home right next door in the villages. So after taking a village, you slept in the home upstairs. And there was fraternization. You talked to them. They did wash clothes for you. There was no place for them to go but stay in their cellars. So that went on a lot, even though it was against the rules at the time. And also, they had to have the elderly in the town to keep the order. Remember, at the time, we didn't speak German, but we found that a lot of the German children evidently took English in German schools, and they could interpret for us. So you did have fraternization that way. And the elderly would come up out of the barns, because that's where they stayed, and they would go out into the fields. We would see them out there, and they would get rid of the dead cattle and what the war left over. So as far as the people were concerned, there was no hostility shown by them to us. They bent over backwards to be helpful and out of your way. And by being helpful, I mean they would dig pits for us, things in the town. They would do the washing of the clothes. They even cooked food. But as far as the living conditions, they all lived in the basements of their homes at that time. And we never heard of anybody being hurt by the German population in those communities at that time, even though the battle just keeps moving on, when you can still hear the sounds of battle in the next community. Because when you were in the fields, you would rather get out of the cold and take a village so that you would have a house to sleep in. That's a lot of times was the incentive to be on the front lines and get into the village first, so you'd have a place to sleep the nights out of the bad weather.
Did you ever have to shoot your weapon?
Yes, many times. Yeah.
At enemy soldiers? Yes,
at enemy soldiers. But you never knew what you hit. Remember, we were all young with a weapon, and you just fired when somebody fired a gun. And you say, well, how did you know where to fire? Well, when everyone had in their first cartridge in their rifle was a illuminated, and it was a fire round. And if anybody saw something, they would fire that weapon. When you watched the pellet or the bullet traversing, that was the spot everybody would fire at. They just follow that cartridge. Okay? And that's the only time you fired. You didn't know what you hit. Because remember, the enemies are in advance of you. They were at the time retreating. Okay? And they'd have a force that would just hold you up by firing a large volume of weapons, and that held you up and let their main forces continue on the retreat.
Did you ever have to deal with any prisoners of war?
Yeah. The only time we dealt with prisoners of war was in Castle. In Castle, in the main square, was the monuments of monuments. It must have been, maybe 300-400 feet high. It was a monument to honor the World War I German veterans. And the Nazis used it as a fortress. And even though we brought up during the night large 240 millimeter weapons that were on tractors, fired at, they just bounced off of it. I saw that. And then the Germans inside the fort, they finally gave up after 3 days and come marching out, and we would walk them down to the streets to the PW compound that was there.
Can you tell me what the German soldiers acted like, if you can remember?
No, because remember, you really had no, unless you were an MP, you had no time or space to deal with any Germans. Immediately when a German was taken captive, say on night patrol, he would be brought in and he would be immediately brought to the rear be interrogated. And everybody took a shot at being on night patrol, even though they didn't like it, because sometimes some of them never came back. But it had to be done in order to keep in contact with the enemy. That's the only way you knew whether they were still there or they were still retreating in leaving you behind is by sending out night patrols. They would be sometimes just 1-man or 2-man patrols. See? Everybody had to take a shot at that.
What was your specific job in the Army?
I was a messenger. An infantry messenger, he has to carry messages from the frontline soldier officers to the rear command posts. In other words, I would run messages that were so important that they didn't dare use the phones because they didn't know whether the Germans which they did, just like the Japanese. They would listen into conversations to find out what was going on in the front lines, or during Midnight Charlie's bombing, he probably blew up the telephone lines because remember they ran over the ground. The guy that laid the wires, he'd have a big roll that attached to his body, and he would run from the front lines back to the command post, and the wire would just spew out. See, so they'd have communication, but you still have to have your messengers, and that's what I did. I ran between the front line and back to the messenger, then I would go back to the front lines. See? And the only beauty of that was I didn't have to go on night patrol because I had to be available to run messages in case the telephone line was out.
Do you feel the war could have gone differently if the U.S. never got involved?
Definitely, yes. Yeah. There was two things. If the Russians didn't defeat the Germans at Stalingrad and the Germans had won, it would have been a whole new ball game. And if the Japanese had caught the American carriers at Hawaii, it would have been a whole new ball game. Because you got to remember they got the battleships, but they never got the carriers, and that was their downfall. Other than that, no. The generals of the service, they knew what they were doing, where to land, and where to drop, to invade. So I think it went off good.
Do you have any regrets?
No, I don't have any. War is hell and always will be hell. I can't see anyone wanting to cease war declared on any countries. It's stupid. Both sides lose. You count up the losses in World War II between the enemy and ourselves. It's unbelievable.
Were you happy when you came home?
Oh yeah, very glad. There was so much misery over there because you got to remember the refugees, no place to go, and this is all the countries I was in. France, up into Belgium, Amsterdam, went from there into Ardennes, into Germany itself, and all the way through Germany, and our division met the Russians on the Elbe River. That was the end of the war. So I saw a lot, and it was nothing but all misery and devastation.
Were you proud that you joined?
I didn't join. I was drafted. I had no choice. Okay.